Welcome, folks, to another episode of IndieSponge. I'm Eric Lavallée with
Kevin Jagernauth.
Kevin. The Telluride lineup, obviously there wasn't a physical edition this year, but they did take the time to put out a title set, sort of like what Cannes did. This one's a little bit slimmer. This one's very docu-friendly. What are your first impressions on what we saw in their lineup?
Yeah, sure. The lineup is very heavy with a lot of overlap with Venice and TIFF, which is not usual for Telluride. They really try to, in a usual year, they might have a few titles that overlap, but they really go out of their way to select films that are unique to them. So that's the first takeaway I had. And to your point, there was a lot of documentaries in the lineup, but what was interesting to me, at least initially, was as part of their lineup, they also list, which other festival it will be at, if that applies, and how to see it, like if it's at the festival, if it's going to be on Amazon, if it's going to stream somewhere. So that's kind of a different step than Cannes took, who were just like, here's some films that have theatrical release dates, mostly in France. So this gives it at least a little bit more of to the cinephile, at least a bit of a guide on how they can catch up with these films after and as they go into the fall.
Yeah, particularly useful since a lot of these films are still unknown entities to the larger public, and especially the kind of cinephile audiences that would normally scoop these titles up in the fall film festival season. I like what you said about how they were proactive in identifying those films and sort of like, this is where you're going to end up seeing it. For example, The Duke already has a 2021 springtime release. It's going to be shown at the Venice Film Festival. And so I like the fact that they identified that, but also what they did with a lot of the docu items and them being available on the HBOs and like in the later months after the TIFF premieres. I was quite taken aback by them including Tribeca titles. Again, yeah, there's a trio of titles that caught my attention, and these are titles that we've seen programmed elsewhere. It also tells me that there might be a little bit more clout, or that critically it'll appease a lot more audiences than just the singular festivals that I thought these titles might be programmed in. So I'm going to first go with a couple of titles. So Ricky Staub's Concrete Cowboy was one of the first titles mentioned at TIFF. Christos Nikos Apples, that was in the Horizonte section at the Venice Film Festival, and that's the opening film there. And a film title that we discussed previously is Gio Coppola's Mainstream. So the fact that it's among the titles that are being identified at Telluride, I think does say something about what we can expect from these films, meaning that there might be a lot more cred on different spheres.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of selections here. Given their crossover status with TIFF or Venice, the fact that they're here does give them a bit more of a boost, certainly. For me, it was actually kind of interesting. One of the titles that popped out as a bit of a curiosity that it was included was Andrei Tarkovsky's Cinema Prayer. I mean, I think that film was on the festival circuit last year. It was released here in Canada, or at least in Montreal, last fall. But as far as I know, it doesn't have US distribution. So perhaps this is Telluride's way of perhaps getting this film back in front of people who can hopefully give it a release stateside, or get it maybe the attention it did not receive last year. That kind of popped out as me as a curious one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually quite interested in the Bee Gees documentary by Frank Marshall, only because the Bee Gees story is pretty wild. They're an interesting, just an interesting musical story. Again, it's another documentary, and it's very documentary heavy lineup. And another one that caught my eye, again outside of the crossover titles, is Dear Mr. Brody, which is the follow-up film by Keith Maitland, who broke out with Tower, this sort of animated documentary from a couple years ago about the mass shooting in Texas. So there are Telluride may not be a typical lineup, but Telluride has done some interesting sort of choices here and there, which make it still exciting to look at.
Yeah, I agree with Tower. It's such an affecting drama, almost thriller-esque in how, and all these intersections from that the gunman standpoint, and how all these figures were sort of like pivoted to, didn't pivot together, but were put in extreme circumstances together. I quite adored that doc. I think Telluride also sort of like reconfirms this idea of this grudge match between Francis Lee's film and Chloe Zhao's film. For Nomadland, they will be having that event in Los Angeles, showing it more or less the same time as TIFF in Venice. But again, Francis Lee, a Cannes Film Festival title that'll have been promoted at TIFF. We still don't know what that screening might look like, but yeah, I think that title being there sort of puts that grudge match into more of a full. There's sort of like this focal point that that exists between those titles in my books.
Yeah, there's still the two titles to. I mean, I don't want to say to beat this year, but like they're really for whatever the award season ends up looking like, they are really the front runners here. It's interesting because we'll know in a matter of weeks if the hype was deserved, if one falls behind the other. So we're not having a traditional award season, but we're going to have those kind of conversations about a smaller group of films. But it's coming, it's we can't avoid it, and it's kind of nice, I guess, to have it, to have something to talk about a little bit.
The film festival the fall film festival season is it's going to unfold in about 4 or 5 weeks time from now, even less than that. Leading the pack, physically right now, Sarajevo was supposed to have that physical event. They canceled at the last second. And then we have San Sebastian is doing some really rugged programming on their own. They are collecting a lot of the Cannes titles, and so is Deauville. But again, Venice identified 2 films. One is the Pedro Almodovar, The Human Voice short that we sort of like had a glimpse into that being put out there fairly soon. And Regina King's One Night in Miami, which was identified as a TIFF selection, got quickly picked up from Amazon, and then was a last-minute selection for Venice. But I think for us, the big news was the New York Film Fest sort of like taking away perhaps the thunder that Steve McQueen could have appeared at Telluride in a normal year, and he's certainly been there in the past. But they added a trio of titles, so that means the 2 titles that were identified at Cannes, well, he's still in post with the other 3 films. So yeah, let's briefly look at that news for the New York Film Fest, which is great that they're able to legitimately show 3 Steve McQueen films.
Yeah, they have New York Film Festival has kind of, I guess, scooped is the word I can use. Steve McQueen's Lovers Rock, Mangrove, but those two were both part of the Cannes selection, and Red, White, and Blue, which are part of his Small Acts film anthology series. So I believe it's Lovers Rock will be the New York opening film. Mangrove and Red, White, and Blue will premiere as part of the festival. But yeah, it's a huge get for them. It's something I don't know if I would have expected it necessarily at Telluride, given the TV origins of the project, but certainly it's very surprising it's not part of TIFF. It seems like a natural fit there, but yeah, it's huge news. And I mean, listen, 2020 has been not fun in a lot of ways, but the fact that we're getting 5 Steve McQueen films is that's pretty awesome. So it's huge. It's something that puts Amazon back in the map in a way. They're releasing the film states, North America, and Amazon has sort of dipped in and out of the auteur worlds over the past few years, but this is a sort of a big statement for them as well, I think.
Mm-hmm. And so this week we happened to get a glimpse of that world. They call it the Small Acts world, I believe, and it got a sense of what this is going to feel like. Obviously, it's of a specific time period. It's fact based, but we also got a sense of how he wanted this to look like. So you get a certain like vintage film quality that I'm particularly excited about. And it looks and feels charged, rightly so. So yeah, I'm enthusiastic, regardless of the situation that we're in, about how it's gonna showcase itself, regardless if it's whatever the events are set up for at the New York Film Fest.
Yeah, I mean that the Small Acts trailer that came out. The immediate my sort of gut reaction was, it seems like McQueen is going. It felt very much in the world of Hunger, that sort of
Mm-hmm.
blend of very political yet very personal and intimate. And so it seems like he's sort of revisiting not that world certainly, but that feeling, I think, and that sort of intensity, which is pretty exciting.
Moving along, so Paul Thomas Anderson is he's readying his film. They're probably already have a strong cast put in place, but we got the first announcement this week, and at the end of the day, we don't know what to expect in terms of the character set that he might present in his I want to say 70s type film, or is it 80s? I don't recall. But did Bradley Cooper being announced, do you consider that a sort of like a curveball, where you, not that we were expecting that as a figure, but like, are you able to mishmash those two people in the same world or the same process?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing is that Paul Thomas Anderson, if you look at all of his films, he has established very strong collaborations with his lead actors. I mean, you think of Philip Seymour Hoffman, Daniel Day-Lewis, Joaquin Phoenix. Those are all actors who worked with him more than once, who all played really complex, interesting characters. And so what this says to me, at least, is, yeah, Bradley Cooper is a surprise, certainly. It's not a name I would necessarily associate with a Paul Thomas Anderson film, but it says to me that, that both of them, both the actor and the director, have a strong sense of what they want to do with the character, whoever it will be in this film, which is set in the 70s in the San Fernando Valley. And it's going to be interesting. I think Bradley Cooper certainly at a new plateau, not plateau, um, a new area in his career. I mean, after A Star Is Born, he sort of can do whatever he wants. He's
Mhm.
making really interesting choices. I mean, he's currently in the midst of making Guillermo del Toro's Nightmare Alley. He has the Bernstein biopic that he'll direct and star in, like in development, and so this feels like a project for him where he's using his clout to I think challenge himself. I would believe.
Mhm. And I think a lot of the worlds that Paul Thomas Anderson creates, they're soaked in a heavy dramatic terrain, but there's also elements that feel dramedy-esque. And I think somebody like Bradley Cooper certainly can, pivot to that. I'm thinking of the O. Russell collaboration, um, but yeah, I get a sense that he's comfortable with in working in different genres or different tones, and it's not that far of a stretch for him. Um, and yeah, I could see him in '70s garb or yeah, in a very distinctive locale, and not sure where he's from, where he's born or where he spent his time, but
Yeah, it's an opportunity surely to step into another world. And the other curious thing about this casting is I remember when it was first announced that the project was moving from Focus to MGM, I believe.
mhm.
Um, it was originally reported in the trades that the budget was the issue for part of the reason of that move, and then they quickly corrected and said no, it's not a budget issue. But one of the thoughts that came to mind is if if Paul Thomas Anderson knew that he wanted Bradley Cooper, I wonder if just his fee alone, Focus was like, we can't. It's like outside of our bracket. We need to move the project because we can't. You know, Cooper's A of the A list at this point. So it makes me wonder if that was part of the conversation when that project moved, just to have the funds to pay someone of his caliber to join
Mhm.
the project.
Good point. Speaking of actors who sort of like not moonlighted as a filmmaker, but yeah, switch hats. Another one of those is Viggo Mortensen. So he was at Sundance earlier this year. He also got, I think, mentioned for Cannes, I believe, and also TIFF as well with Falling. And so he's going to be reteaming with Lisandro Alonso, the Argentinian filmmaker, for a film that's been in gestation for a little while. It's seen that Lisandro adheres to something that's far more art house uh, than commercial work. So Eureka's been in the financing stages for a while, and so Variety identified that he was just a week out from shooting, from going into production, and so what we do know is that there's a reteaming of those two elements, and Cheria Mastriani and Maria de Medeiros, the blueberry muffin, or is it blueberry pancakes from Pulp Fiction, actress and director, are involved in this project. So yeah, before we start going into what that might mean, um, how do you feel about his painterly, lyrical, poetic worlds that he creates, and sort of like where this fits in his filmography, or in today's cinema, I guess?
So yeah, this is a filmmaker whose work I have not dived into at all, to be honest with you. But we do know that he does favor, almost slow cinema kind of aesthetic. He really marches to the beat of his own drum, and he certainly um, doesn't follow traditional narrative in any sense. He sort of likes to be a bit more enigmatic. and have a lot of space for I guess the audience to sort of fill in those traditional gaps, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
So, but this project is certainly sounds at least his most ambitious yet. I mean, this is just to get into it a little bit. This is a film that will have 4 distinct parts over 4 different time periods and multiple locations, you know, ranging from the U.S. to the Amazon and elsewhere. The interesting thing about the Mortensen casting is that it's very similar. His role is very similar, and his co-stars are very similar to Jauja.
Mm-hmm.
So in this film, Eureka, he plays a father on the U.S. Mexico border, searching for his daughter, played by Villebjörk Malling Auger, who has also played his daughter in Jauja, who's been kidnapped. And in that film, she runs away with somebody, and he goes to find her. And in this film, she's kidnapped, and he goes to find her. So that's an interesting element. It's apparently not a sequel or not tied to this previous film at all, but he's certainly exploring those kind of dynamics again, I think. At least in that portion of the film, which is apparently part 1.
Well, a lot of what you're saying certainly explains the gap. He was a prolific filmmaker in the early noughts. A lot of his films were festival darlings, and then he came out with Liverpool in 2008. Jiao Jiao was 2014. So this is a very vast project and ambitious, and it's something that we'll probably not even see in 2021. So we could keep that off our most anticipated lists, and just because of the nature of the filming. And I imagine he wants ice caps. I imagine he wants like a Western backdrop. So something allows us to sort of like reinvestigate Jiaojia and what that might mean for something that is more painterly, I guess, on a larger scale. Moving along, we have Joe Wright and MGM that are partnering on a fairly big production, stage to film project. CYRANO. It's got a cast in place. I think MGM are in a really interesting place right now. They're hungry. As you know, just during the COVID times, I think they've attached themselves to a lot of projects, clout-worthy projects. And for Joe Wright, I think this is sort of like, again, another chance for him to explore a different facet of where his interest might lie. And so what are your thoughts about Joe Wright sort of exploring the stage to film, or the musical element, and of course the chosen quartet?
Yeah, so this is an interesting project. It's being led by Peter Dinklage and Haley Bennett, who both did this production together on stage, and so they're going to reprise their roles here. For Joe Wright, he's a director who has moved from genre to genre, not always with success, but certainly with a lot of ambition. It was 5 years ago that he came out with Pan, which did not do well. I mean, I'm probably one of the few who will defend that film, but that did have musical elements to it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel this is an opportunity for him to step back and maybe step more fully into a musical mode. So that's an interesting facet for me. The supporting cast is equally interesting. He's got Ben Mendelsohn, who sang on the Lost River soundtrack. So he's perhaps going to be singing a bit more than we're used to here. And Brian Tyree Henry, who's just in everything now, which is great. But he's a really good supporting piece of this puzzle as well. So, and Brian Tyree Henry is actually in The Woman in the Window, Joe Wright's film, which is moving from Fox to Netflix. has been plagued by rumors of reshoots. So we'll see what happens with that film. But it's interesting. I mean, I think Joe Wright, he isn't always successful, but he's a filmmaker that I kind of like to see what he's doing, because when he gets into the zone, he's very exciting to watch.
Yeah, I think for fans of cinema, they can cherry pick their title to defend. Personally, for me, it's Atonement. But um, one thing's for one thing's for sure is that this will be a much more contained project, and so during these crazy times, perhaps production will be that much less difficult. Um,
Maybe, but they're also singing. So, I mean, talk about like breathing into the air. That's going to be a challenge. Um, but yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the scale of the film is. And I think the other element here is that, two members from the National are doing the music, which is certainly, that alone will put the film into, it's going to attract a lot of attention based on that alone, I think. So, yeah, this is a very high profile project for everyone involved. And anytime Hollywood makes a musical, it's not a genre that the studios touch upon very often. But as we saw with La La Land, when it hits, when it really connects, it could be, this could be a huge deal. So I think it's certainly one that, no matter the size of the production, could have a lot of legs.
you bring on some really good points there. Lastly, we have a project that is sort of being pitched as the next Beau Travail, and it's also employing a Beau Travail figure. So, as we both know, Locarno sort of had to adapt to the COVID situation. What they did is they were really proactive in supporting projects that physically don't really exist, but are in different stages of production. I'm thinking of the initial 10 international filmmakers, but they're also getting behind some newbie talents. And among those people, we have a filmmaker named Helena Wittman. She's a cinematographer who's done a lot of smaller shorts, but started her filmmaking career with a film that she released at Venice called Drift. And so the Variety had mentioned that her next project involves one of the Dogtooth ladies and Denis Lavant. So yeah, these are the type of films that end up populating some of the larger fests, Eurofests in the upcoming year ahead. Berlin or maybe Locarno, God knows which one. But yeah, Angeliki Papoulia is going to be one of the faces in a project I feel might be sort of like dependent on a certain lyricism and a lot of imagery and yeah. I don't know if you want to dig down into that, but yeah, what was your?
Yeah. So yeah, you're right. This is a film that would be something, I would circle on a Cannes or Venice lineup as something that's intriguing. So we have, Denis. You mentioned the two actors, Denis Lavant and Angeliki Papoulia, in a story that is inspired by Beau Travail. In this case, it's about a woman who takes a trip on a ship with an all-male crew, goes to Marseille, Corsica, then eventually lands in Algeria, where she meets a Legionnaire, played by Denis Lavant, who also played a Legionnaire in Beau Travail. So there are some echoes there. It'll be interesting to see how they connect or don't connect, or whether narratively or thematically. I would assume more the latter.
Mhm.
And yeah, I mean, it's, again, I don't have much to say except, it's a film that to keep an eye on, because it's one of those projects that could surprise, it could break out and really get this filmmaker, you know, some greater notice and some more attention. So yeah, I mean, that's about all I can say. It's one to see how it progresses. I believe it's going to start shooting very shortly. So it could be something we see as soon as next year, making its way across the circuit.
Yeah, Human Flowers of Flesh is something that we'll be tracking, and I think Angelika, her talent set, her skill set is certainly something I like revisiting. I like seeing how she's shaping her filmography. And for Denis, I think he's in an interesting sort of like chance. He's touching a lot of projects, including Rick Alverson's film. He did a Canadian production recently with Maxime Giroux, and so like I like the fact that this very physical actor and very enigmatic actor is becoming a sort of like Udo Kier in a way, but with a little bit more clout, I guess. So definitely something you want to keep an eye on. If it resembles anything to Claire Denis' film. And that wraps up another edition. Thanks for listening and checking us out. I'm Eric Lavallée. I'm editor-in-chief and site owner for IONCINEMA.com. And this is
Kevin Jagernauth, contributing writer for the playlist.
And together we are IndieSponge.